The envelope arrived quietly, without ceremony, without warning. But what it carried had the potential to deepen one of the most public family rifts of modern times. Inside were numbers that would shock even seasoned palace insiders. Tens of millions of dollars tied to legal battles, security costs, and personal claims. And at the center of it all stood a prince who once walked the corridors of power, now facing the consequences of decisions made far beyond palace walls. For years, tensions had simmered between Prince Harry and the institution he left behind. At first, the disagreements appeared personal, rooted in differences of vision, independence, and privacy. But as time passed, those differences evolved into something more tangible. They began to intersect with money, responsibility, and the boundaries of what the monarchy should, or should not, support. The document that sparked the latest controversy reportedly outlined a massive financial request. Legal fees, security expenses, contingents of funds, and compensation for lost opportunities were all included. The sum climbed higher with each line, forming a total that transformed the request from routine to extraordinary. It wasn't simply a matter of covering costs. It was a demand that forced the monarchy to confront a difficult question. Where does personal responsibility end and institutional duty begin? Inside the palace, reactions were said to be measured but firm. The legal battles were viewed as a personal initiative, one chosen independently. From that perspective, the financial consequences followed the same logic. If the decision to pursue the case was individual, the responsibility for funding it would also remain individual. The response, when it came, was decisive. The request would not be granted. The refusal carried weight beyond the numbers. It signaled a shift in how the relationship between the monarchy and its non-working members might operate moving forward. The idea that the royal institution would automatically intervene during financial difficulty appeared to be fading. Instead, a new principle emerged. Independence also meant accountability. While discussions unfolded behind closed doors, the legal battle itself continued in public view. Courtrooms became arenas where allegations, testimony, and counter-arguments shaped the narrative. What had begun as a challenge to media practices gradually transformed into a high-risk confrontation. Evidence that was expected to strengthen the case instead introduced uncertainty. Statements shifted, credibility was questioned, and the outcome grew less predictable. As the proceedings progressed, financial implications grew heavier. Legal analysts began estimating potential costs if the case failed. The numbers, already significant, climbed into tens of millions. The possibility that the fight could end not in victory but in substantial financial liability became increasingly real. Beyond the courtroom, public appearances drew scrutiny of a different kind. Moments that might once have passed unnoticed were now dissected frame by frame. Gestures, expressions, and interactions were interpreted as signals of stability or strain. Supporters saw normal affection. Critics saw calculated presentation. Every appearance became another chapter in a story shaped as much by perception as by reality. Meanwhile, the broader royal family continued its duties. Engagement proceeded, ceremonies unfolded, and the institution projected continuity. The contrast between the structured rhythm of monarchy and the uncertainty surrounding the legal battle added to the sense of separation. The paths, once closely aligned, now appeared distinctly different. Observers noted the symbolism. On one side stood an institution emphasizing tradition, stability, and collective responsibility. On the other stood an individual navigating independence, legal conflict, and public scrutiny. Neither path was simple, but the distance between them was unmistakable. As the case moved toward its conclusion, speculation intensified. Would the legal challenge deliver vindication, or would it bring financial consequences? Would relationships within the family soften, or would boundaries harden further? The uncertainty created a sense of suspense that extended beyond legal arguments into questions about identity and legacy. For Prince Harry, the stakes were deeply personal. Once seen as one of the most relatable members of the royal family, he now faced a crossroads shaped by choices that carried both principle and risk. The outcome would influence not only finances but also public perception, future opportunities, and his place within the broader narrative of modern royalty. The story, however, was never solely about money. It was about independence, what it costs, what it requires, and what it reveals. The refusal to cover the requested amount underscored a reality that independence can bring freedom, but also responsibility. The safety net that once seemed implicit was no longer guaranteed. As days passed, the narrative grew more complex. Legal developments, public commentary, and family dynamics intertwined. Each new detail added another layer. What began as a dispute over funding evolved into a broader reflection on how tradition adapts to change. The atmosphere surrounding the case became almost cinematic. Courtrooms filled with tension. Headlines echoed speculation. Analysts debated outcomes. Yet beneath all the noise lay a quieter truth. The situation represented a turning point, not just for one individual, but for how the monarchy defines its boundaries in a modern world. The future remained uncertain. Financial pressures, public expectations, and personal decisions would continue shaping the path forward. The latest wave of controversy began with something deceptively ordinary on the surface, paperwork. But inside that paperwork was a financial demand so large, so layered, and so politically sensitive that it immediately shifted the tone of an already strained relationship between Harry and the institution he was born into. The figure being discussed was staggering. $59 million. Not as a rumor in passing, not as speculation on social media, but as a structured breakdown tied to legal costs, security arrangements, and broader financial claim connected to ongoing litigation. To some, it looked like a request for support during a high-risk legal battle. To others inside palace circles, it looked like something entirely different, a line being drawn in the sand. Because this was no longer just about lawsuits or headlines. It was about responsibility. About whether choices made independently still carried expectations of institutional support, and about whether the monarchy, an institution built on tradition and continuity, could or should absorb the consequences of decisions taken outside its direct control. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was not theatrical. There were no dramatic statements, no public confrontations. Instead, there was something more telling: distance. The kind of distance that signals a finality in tone even before words are formally exchanged. The response, when it came, was firm. The request would not be accepted, not because the numbers were impossible, not because the legal battle lacked significance, but because, according to palace reasoning, the origin of a decision mattered more than the scale of the cost. The case was not initiated by the Crown. It was not directed by royal instruction. It was a personal legal strategy pursued independently, and therefore the financial burden, however large, was also personal. That distinction, personal versus institutional, became the silent axis on which everything turned. While this unfolded behind palace walls, the legal world outside was already moving at full speed. The courtroom had become more than a legal arena. It had become a stage where credibility, evidence, and narrative all collided under intense scrutiny. What had once been framed as a straightforward challenge against media practices had evolved into something far more fragile. Witness statements came under examination. Evidence once considered central was questioned. Assumptions that had supported the case began to show gaps under pressure. Each development did not just affect the legal outcome, it affected perception. And perception, in a case so deeply public, carried weight almost equal to the law itself. At the same time, the financial implications continued to expand in the background. Legal experts quietly estimated the potential exposure if the case failed. Not just legal fees, but opposing costs, extended proceedings, and associated penalties. The numbers began to converge toward a range that would place extraordinary strain on even high-profile finances. And yet, perhaps the most striking part of the entire situation was not the money itself. It was the isolation forming around it. Inside the wider royal family structure, life continued with precision. Engagements were fulfilled. Duties carried on. The institution, by design, does not pause for individual disputes. It adapts. It absorbs. It continues forward. That continuity created contrast. On one side, a system defined by collective identity. On the other, an individual navigating consequences in a far more exposed environment. The separation was not declared publicly, but it was visible in rhythm, in presence, and in priority. Outside the courtroom and palace, public interpretation added another layer entirely. Every appearance by Harry became subject to analysis. Every gesture, Every interaction, every moment captured on camera was reinterpreted through competing narratives. To supporters, it reflected resilience under pressure. To critics, it suggested careful image management in the middle of escalating scrutiny. Neither interpretation could fully dominate, and that tension kept the story alive far beyond legal documents or official statements. Meanwhile, Meghan Markle's professional world continued to develop independently, with business ventures, media projects, and brand positioning forming a parallel narrative. For some observers, this was seen as stability and forward momentum. For others, it was interpreted through the lens of separation of interests. In either case, it added complexity to an already layered situation. But beneath all of it, beyond commentary, beyond headlines, beyond courtroom arguments, lay a more fundamental shift. The assumption that royal association automatically provided financial or structural support was no longer operating in the same way it once had. Whether by design or by circumstance, the boundaries had become more defined. Requests that might once have been quietly absorbed were now being evaluated through stricter lines of responsibility. That shift changed the meaning of the $59 million request entirely. It was no longer just a bill. It became a test case for where modern monarchy draws its limits. As the legal proceedings moved forward, uncertainty began to dominate. Outcomes that once seemed predictable no longer felt secure. Each hearing introduced new variables. Each testimony adjusted expectations. And each delay extended the pressure surrounding both financial and reputational stakes. For Harry, the challenge was no longer just about winning or losing a case. It was about what either outcome would represent. A victory could validate his long-standing claims and reshape public understanding of his battle with the press. A loss, however, could carry consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom: financial strain, reputational damage, and a reinforcement of institutional distance. And all of it unfolded under the gaze of global attention. Because this was never just a private dispute. It had become a public narrative about independence, loyalty, responsibility, and the cost of breaking away from established systems. The more the story developed, the more it stopped being about a single document or a single refusal. It became about structure, how institutions respond when individual powers diverge too far from collective expectations. And in that sense, the most important development was not the rejection of the $59 million request. It was what that rejection represented. A boundary had been made visible, not loudly, not emotionally, but clearly. And once boundaries become visible, they cannot be unseen. As the legal case continued and the royal institution maintained its distance, the future remained suspended between possibility and consequence. Nothing was fully resolved. Nothing was fully closed. But one thing had become certain. The relationship between independence and support had changed shape. And whatever came next, in court, in public perception, or within the royal family itself, would unfold within that new reality. The silence after the rejection carried more weight than the document itself. No dramatic announcement followed. No public confrontation erupted from the palace. There was only a quiet, institutional firmness, the kind that does not seek attention but leaves no space for misunderstanding. The $59 million request, in whatever form it was presented, had been turned away. And in that moment, something deeper than a financial dispute became visible. It was no longer just about money. It was about separation. And once that separation became financially explicit, the emotional distance that had been discussed for years suddenly gained structure. Inside palace circles, the decision was framed in procedural terms. Responsibility, autonomy, precedent. These were the words repeated behind closed doors. But beneath those terms was a simple reality. The monarchy was drawing a clearer boundary than it had in previous years. If a decision is made independently, then the consequences follow independently. That principle, once theoretical, was now operational. For Prince Harry, the situation was far more complicated than a single refusal. The financial request represented not just costs already incurred, but a broader argument that the legal battle he was engaged in had implications extending beyond personal grievance. It was framed as a fight involving reputation, press accountability, and institutional history. But institutions rarely respond to arguments of implication. They respond to structure, and structure, in this case, was unforgiving. As the legal case continued to unfold, the courtroom became a second battlefield, one that operated under different rules but carried equally heavy consequences. Evidence was no longer simply presented. It was interrogated, dissected, and reinterpreted under scrutiny that left very little room for narrative control. What once appeared to be a strong legal framework began to show complexity in unexpected places. Statements that were meant to support the case were challenged. Assumptions that had formed the backbone of the argument were tested against procedural reality. And slowly, the certainty that had once surrounded the case began to thin. Not collapse, but thin. And in high-profile litigation, thinning certainty is often more dangerous than outright failure because it changes momentum. Momentum is everything in cases like this. Outside the courtroom, the financial pressure continued to build quietly. Legal analysts speculated about worst-case outcomes, factoring in not only Harry's own legal expenses but the possibility of covering opposing costs if the case did not succeed. When combined, the numbers began to form a range that moved beyond symbolic figures into deeply consequential territory. Tens of millions. Not hypothetical in tone, but procedural in calculation. And yet, even that was not the most defining aspect of the situation. The most defining aspect was that all of this was happening while life elsewhere continued without interruption. The monarchy did not pause. It rarely does. Engagements were still carried out. Public duties were still performed. The machinery of royal obligation continued with its expected rhythm. Visits, ceremonies, appearances, schedules that do not bend for personal disputes, even when those disputes involve someone once central to the public image of the institution. That contrast became increasingly noticeable. One system moved collectively, as a unit designed to persist beyond individuals. The other moved individually, carrying the weight of decisions that could not be redistributed. Neither approach was inherently right or wrong, but they were fundamentally different in how they absorbed pressure. And pressure, at this stage, defined everything. Public interpretation added another unpredictable layer. Every appearance by Harry became a subject of analysis that extended far beyond its immediate context. A smile was examined. A gesture was interpreted. A brief interaction was slowed down, replayed, and debated across media platforms. To supporters, these moments represented resilience under scrutiny, a couple maintaining composure in the face of sustained attention. To critics, they represented something more calculated, a managed image designed for visibility in a world where attention functions as currency. Both interpretations